Mock me again. I dare you." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, quiet, deliberate, and spreading in every direction at once. The entire dining room of Aurelian, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, went completely silent. Forks stilled mid-air. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Conversations evaporated into the candlelit dark as every pair of eyes turned toward the source of that voice. A waiter in a plain black uniform, standing at the center of the room with his hands loose at his sides, his posture unhurried, his gaze fixed on the woman seated before him, with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to fear and nothing left to prove. Victoria Sterling, billionaire CEO of Sterling Technologies, stared back at him. She had expected an apology. She had expected the performance she had seen 100 times before the lowering of the eyes, the mumbled deference, the retreat. Instead, she got something she had not encountered in years, perhaps ever. A man who simply refused to move. 5 minutes earlier, she had humiliated him in front of the entire restaurant. She had mocked his uniform, the careful patches at the seams she had noticed with visible disdain. She had glanced pointedly at his shoes, polished but worn at the heel, and let the corners of her mouth do the cruelest possible work. She had made a joke about his profession, about his life, about the invisible ceiling she believed separated his world from hers. What she did not know, what no one in that room knew except for the man himself, was that the quiet, composed single father she had chosen to humiliate held a secret powerful enough to collapse a billion-dollar deal before the dessert menu was ever presented. Ethan Parker was 40 years old, though most people who saw him for the first time guessed slightly older, not because of his appearance but because of something in the way he moved, a steadiness, a patience, the particular ease of a man who had already survived the worst thing life could do to him and had found a way to keep going. He had been working at Aurelian for 3 years, and in that time he had become one of the most quietly respected members of the staff. Not the loudest, not the most charming in the theatrical sense that some servers cultivated. The quick jokes and the practiced warmth designed to manufacture connection. Ethan's presence was something different. It was genuine, and the guests who paid attention, who looked past the uniform and the rehearsed pleasantries, could feel it. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens with his 12-year-old daughter, Maya, who he dropped at school every morning before taking the subway into Manhattan, and who he called during his break every shift to ask about her day in the careful, attentive way that suggested those calls were the best part of his. His wife, Claire, had died 4 years earlier, a sudden illness, the kind that arrives without warning and dismantles everything. In the aftermath of her death, Ethan had made choices that the people who knew him from his earlier life found difficult to understand. He had walked away from a career that by any measure had been exceptional. He had simplified his life down to its most essential components: his daughter, his work, his integrity. He did not explain these choices to people who asked, and he did not feel the need to. The restaurant suited him in ways that were not immediately obvious. It required precision, endurance, emotional regulation, and an almost meditative ability to remain present under pressure, all qualities he had spent years cultivating. First in boardrooms, and later, more profoundly, in grief. His colleagues liked him instinctively, the way people are drawn to someone who makes the room feel calmer simply by being in it. The kitchen staff, the hostesses, the sommelier, they all recognized something in Ethan that they could not quite name but consistently sought out when the shift turned difficult. On the evening that would change everything, the restaurant's general manager, a compact, efficient man named Daniel Reyes, had pulled the staff together before service for a briefing that carried an unusual note of tension. A reservation had been made, a party of 6. The name on the booking was one that everyone in the room recognized immediately, because it was the kind of name that appeared regularly in financial publications and on the covers of business magazines and in the headlines that people forwarded to each other with a mix of admiration and something darker, harder to name. Victoria Sterling was coming to Aurelian that evening. Daniel had said it plainly, without drama, and then spent several minutes explaining what that meant in practical terms. Perfect service, 0 errors, full attention. No improvisation, The staff nodded with the focused seriousness of a crew preparing for something genuinely high stakes. Ethan had nodded along with the rest of them, his expression unchanged. He was assigned to the VIP table in the eastern alcove, the most private and coveted section of the restaurant, where the lighting was warmest and the distance from neighboring tables was greatest. He had prepared his section with his usual thoroughness, checked the glassware twice, confirmed the table setting, reviewed the evening specials with the attention of someone who took the work seriously, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He was standing near the service corridor, making a final check of his mise en place, when the front door of Aurelian opened and Victoria Sterling walked in. She entered the restaurant the way people enter spaces they have already claimed in their minds without hesitation. Without the small social adjustments that most people make when they step into an unfamiliar room. She did not scan the space looking for landmarks or assess the other guests. She moved as though the room had been arranged around her, and to a significant extent, it had been. She was dressed simply, which was its own kind of statement. A dark jacket, tailored with the kind of precision that announces serious money without needing to announce anything at all. She was followed by 5 people, a pair of men in suits who were clearly lawyers, a younger woman with a tablet who managed the constant low-level logistics of Victoria's professional life, and 2 investors whose names appeared regularly in the financial press when discussions of tech sector funding arose. The restaurant registered her arrival with a collective shift in atmosphere, the particular social electricity that moves through a room when someone with genuine power enters it. A table nearby whispered. The hostess straightened almost imperceptibly. Daniel Reyes appeared at the door with a warmth he reserved for approximately 3 categories of guest, and guided Victoria's party toward the eastern alcove, with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what this evening represented for the restaurant's reputation. Ethan watched them settle from a respectful distance, noting the dynamic of the group, the way the lawyers positioned themselves strategically, the way the investors leaned forward with the alert interest of people who were still performing for the woman at the head of the table, the way Victoria herself surveyed the space, with eyes that missed nothing and conceded nothing. He approached the table with the measured confidence of a professional who had served difficult guests before, and understood that the most important thing he could offer was his own composure. He introduced himself quietly, described the evening's menu with precision and without unnecessary elaboration, and answered the table's initial questions with the kind of knowledgeable brevity that good service requires. For the first 15 minutes, the evening proceeded normally. The appetizers were ordered, the wine was selected, the conversation among Victoria's party was professional and clipped, the kind of talk that surrounds large financial undertakings carefully worded, strategically vague, dense with implication. Ethan moved between the table and the service corridor with the practiced efficiency that made him good at his job, anticipating needs before they were expressed, ensuring that glasses were never empty, and that the pacing of service matched the rhythm of the conversation. And then Victoria Sterling began to show him who she actually was. It started with small things. A comment about the temperature of the room delivered in a tone that assigned blame. A remark about the bread that was technically a question but functioned as a criticism. A sideways observation about the lighting made while looking directly at Ethan in a way that made it clear the lighting was a pretext. Her companions responded to these observations the way people respond when the most powerful person in the room begins signaling displeasure with careful silence or with thin, accommodating laughter. Ethan remained professional. He addressed each concern specifically and without defensiveness, adjusted what could be adjusted, and acknowledged what could not. He did not allow her manner to alter his own, but he felt the change in the room's temperature, the way a shift in atmosphere can be felt before it is fully understood. The incident that brought everything into the open was, in the context of what followed, almost absurdly minor. Ethan had brought to the table a sparkling mineral water when Victoria had wanted still. It was possible that the mistake was a moment of distraction or a miscommunication during the ordering process. It was also possible that the order had never been clearly specified. In the normal course of a busy evening at a restaurant of Aurelian's caliber, such a thing would have been corrected in 10 seconds with a brief apology and a replacement glass. Victoria Sterling did not treat it as a minor thing. She set the glass down with a deliberateness that drew the attention of the nearby tables. And then she looked at Ethan with an expression that had moved several degrees beyond irritation into something more calculated. When she spoke, her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. It carried, instead, the particular quality of someone who has spent years using precision and control as instruments of cruelty, louder in its implications than any shout. "Do you know," she said, "how many years of education it takes to pour the right kind of water?" The table reacted. The lawyers shifted in their chairs. The investors exchanged a glance. The assistant kept her eyes on her tablet. One of the investors, a man who had clearly read Victoria's social cues for long enough to know when participation would be rewarded, let out a short laugh that was more strategy than amusement. Ethan began to respond a brief, professional apology, the standard language of de-escalation that the job required. Victoria did not give him the space. She continued, her voice gaining a silky confidence as she felt the room's attention gathering around her. She made a remark about the apparent level of education required to work in his position, framed as an observation rather than an attack, but with the full weight of an attack behind it. She glanced at his shoes worn at the heel, carefully polished, and let her eyes move back to his face with an expression that communicated volumes about the distance she perceived between them. She said something about the particular kind of life that produced a man of 40 who was still taking orders for a living, and there was laughter at the table, not the genuine kind but the social kind, the kind that people produce to show alignment with whoever holds the power in the room. The guests at the two nearest tables had gone quiet. A woman a few feet away looked down at her own plate with the visible discomfort of someone who was witnessing something she wished she were not witnessing but did not know how to address. Ethan stood at the table and absorbed all of it, without the defensive shift in posture or the tightening around the eyes that would have been entirely human and understandable. He offered a clean, genuine apology for the water, just the water. Nothing more, and he said he would have it corrected immediately. Victoria looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had expected to land a heavier impact. She leaned back in her chair. "Some people," she said, with the careful diction of someone who had rehearsed this thought in some form many times before, "are simply born to serve. And some people are born to be served." The room heard it. Every person in the vicinity of that table heard it, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was the specific, loaded silence of collective discomfort, the kind that happens when something that should not have been said in public has been said in public. And everyone present is waiting to see what happens next. The manager on the floor that evening, a woman named Sandra Lim, who had been with Aurelian for 7 years and had seen a wide range of difficult situations, reached Ethan's side within 60 seconds of the incident escalating. She had been monitoring the table from a distance with the practiced wariness of a professional who had already identified Victoria Sterling as a guest who required careful management. Victoria, apparently invigorated by the audience her remarks had gathered, did not wait for Sandra to assume control of the situation. She addressed the manager directly, and without diplomatic cushioning. The waiter had been incompetent, had failed to meet a basic standard, and she wanted him removed from her table. Permanently. She used the word fired once, and though she did not press it, the word sat in the air with genuine weight. Sandra handled the moment with the careful neutrality her position required, promising to address the situation and attempting to redirect the table's energy toward the meal. Ethan, for his part, stepped back from the table with a composure that Sandra would later describe as one of the most remarkable things she had seen in her professional career. He did not argue. He did not explain himself. He offered a quiet acknowledgement of the concern, took responsibility for the error without qualification, and moved toward the service corridor with the even pace of someone who had not been rattled. A junior server named Marcus, who was 19 years old, and had been watching the entire exchange from near the host stand, with the wide-eyed attention of someone seeing workplace dynamics in their harshest form for the first time, followed Ethan to the corridor a few minutes later. He was visibly upset in a way that Ethan was not. He leaned against the wall beside Ethan and asked, in the low and somewhat incredulous tone of a young man who had not yet made peace with the reality that certain people behave the way Victoria had just behaved, how Ethan was able to stand there and take it. Ethan was quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when the answer they are about to give is one they have arrived at through genuine experience rather than theory. Then he said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his professional life, and would repeat to his own colleagues years later when they found themselves in situations that required the same kind of clarity. He said, "People can only humiliate you if you let them decide what your worth is. I already know what I'm worth." Back in the dining room, Victoria had resumed her conversation with the ease of someone who had tidied up a small interruption and returned to more important matters. One of her investors said something that made her laugh, and her attention moved back to the deal being assembled across the table. She had, as far as she was concerned, resolved a minor personnel issue and moved on. She did not see Ethan standing in the corridor, and she did not see the quiet certainty on his face. She would not have recognized what she was looking at if she had. Ethan's phone buzzed in his apron pocket just after 9 o'clock, during a brief interval while Sandra managed the VIP table alone and the kitchen ran a late course adjustment. He checked the screen, saw a number he recognized, and stepped into the small corridor that ran behind the service bar, where the staff took calls away from the dining room. The voice on the other end who held a seat on the board of a private investment consortium called Meridian Capital Partners, a fund that operated with a deliberate opacity that was, in financial circles, both its most commented upon characteristic and the primary source of its considerable reputation. Gerald was in his late 60s, unhurried in the way that powerful men who have already proved everything they needed to prove tend to be, and his tone was the particular blend of respect and urgency that he used when the situation required both. He got to the point quickly. The consortium needed Ethan's authorization. Tonight, there was a transaction pending, a significant one that had been in negotiation for several months, and had reached the final stage at which Ethan's specific approval was required under the terms of the original fund agreement. Ethan listened without speaking for the first 30 seconds, his back to the wall, his eyes on the middle distance of the corridor. The circumstances required a brief recounting, though Gerald knew better than to deliver it as if Ethan were unfamiliar with his own history. Ethan Parker had not always been a waiter at Aurelian. Before Claire died, before the grief that had reorganized everything in his life, Ethan had been a co-founder of Meridian Capital Partners, a fund he had helped structure, had helped grow from a concept into one of the most quietly influential private investment vehicles in the technology sector. He had been, in the years before Claire's illness, one of those people whose name appeared occasionally in the footnotes of major financial stories, never at the center, but always present in a way that the people who understood how capital actually moved found more interesting than the names at the top. After Claire died, he had done something that his former colleagues had initially interpreted as a temporary breakdown. He had quietly stepped back from the fund's day-to-day operations, restructured his involvement into a limited role that required his sign-off on major transactions, but nothing more, and had disappeared into a quieter life that no one in his former world quite understood. He had not sold his stake. He had not relinquished his authority. He had simply chosen, with the particular decisiveness of a man who has stopped caring about what other people think of his choices, to live differently. He told almost no one. The staff at Aurelian did not know. The guests he served did not know. Sandra did not know. Marcus certainly did not know. The secret was not kept out of shame or strategic calculation. It was kept because Ethan had found, in the years since Claire's death, that the life he was living at Aurelian, the precise, physical, present-tense work of caring for people, of attending to their immediate comfort, was the only thing that had made the grief bearable. And he had no interest in complicating it. Gerald explained the transaction. Meridian Capital Partners was the final and decisive investor in a technology acquisition that had been in assembly for nearly a year. The acquisition required Ethan's formal approval to proceed. The deal was set to close by midnight. The transaction Gerald was describing was not a small thing, and Ethan understood its dimensions precisely because he had been tracking it, quietly, from a distance, for the better part of 6 months. It involved a technology company, a mid-sized firm specializing in enterprise software infrastructure, that had attracted the interest of several large players looking to acquire capabilities rather than build them. The acquisition required a capital infusion at the final stage that Meridian was uniquely positioned to provide, partly because of the fund's specific expertise in technology sector valuations, and partly because of the relationships that Ethan and his co-founders had built over many years in the industry. The deal was worth, at closing, several $billion. It was the kind of transaction that, when completed, would generate the sort of coverage that dominated business news for a week, with profiles and analysis and retrospective breakdowns of how the pieces had come together. For Victoria Sterling, this deal was not incidental. It was critical. Sterling Technologies, the company she had built over 15 years into one of the most recognized names in enterprise technology, had been positioning itself for exactly this kind of expansion. The acquisition was a strategic move that her board had approved and her investors had backed, and it required the final capital commitment from Meridian to cross the threshold. Without it, the deal did not close. And if the deal did not close, if it fell apart at this stage, this publicly, with this many parties aware of how far along the negotiations had come, the consequences for Sterling Technologies would be significant. Stock price pressure, media scrutiny, questions about Victoria's judgment and her ability to execute at the highest level. These were not theoretical concerns. Victoria was sophisticated enough to understand them completely, and that understanding was part of why she sat at that table in Aurelian that evening, with the particular confidence of someone who believed every piece was in place. Ethan could hear, through the service corridor's wall, the faint sound of conversation from the dining room. He could not make out words, but he recognized the rhythm of Victoria's voice, assured, declarative, carrying. He stood in the corridor with his phone pressed to his ear, and Gerald's voice describing a timeline and a process. And he said very little in response, just enough to confirm that he understood what was being asked and when it was needed. Gerald paused and then asked, with the careful tact of someone who knew that the question carried weight beyond its face value, whether Ethan had any concerns about the transaction itself. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would give Gerald his answer before the end of the evening. He returned the phone to his pocket and stood in the corridor for another few seconds, very still. Then he straightened the front of his apron and walked back into the dining room. The evening continued. Ethan returned to the VIP table with the steady professionalism that his work required. And the service proceeded. Entrees arrived. Glasses were refilled. The pacing of the meal moved through its careful stages. Victoria's table had largely moved past the earlier incident in the way that powerful people move past moments of cruelty. Once the moment has served its purpose, not forgotten, but filed, the way one files a tool that has been used and set aside. The investors were engaged in a detailed conversation about regulatory environments and market position. The lawyers had moved into a mode of careful, technical listening. Victoria herself was in full command of the narrative at the table, speaking with the fluid authority of someone who had delivered some version of this presentation many times and knew exactly which points landed. She told the group, with the particular satisfaction of someone whose confidence in the outcome was genuine, that the acquisition was essentially done. The last piece was in place. Everything would be signed by midnight. She used the word inevitable once, casually, as a descriptor for the deal's closing, in the way that people use the word when they have convinced themselves that outcomes have already been determined, and all that remains is the formality of confirmation. Ethan was at the adjacent service station when she said this. He was refilling a water carafe with the particular focus of someone doing a small task well, and he heard the word inevitable and did not respond to it in any visible way. But he heard it. He thought of Gerald's voice on the phone. He thought of the fund document that bore his name and specified his authority. He thought about what the word inevitable meant to the woman at that table, and what it would mean to her in approximately 45 minutes. The investors asked questions. Victoria answered them with the confidence of a person who had prepared for every scenario she could envision. The lawyers made quiet notes. The dinner moved forward. Ethan served the table with the same quality of attention he had maintained throughout the evening. And no one at that table, not the lawyers, not the investors, not the assistant with her tablet, gave him any thought at all. The second significant act of cruelty, came later in the evening, after the main course had been cleared, and the table was in the particular relaxed register that follows a good meal, a little warmer, a little less guarded. One of the investors, a man named Richard Holt, who had the comfortable confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where money was made, turned in his chair and addressed Ethan directly. The question he asked was performed for the table's benefit as much as it was directed at Ethan, and everyone present understood that. He asked whether Ethan had ever thought about doing something bigger with his life, whether the work he did, the carrying of plates, the pouring of wine, the servicing of other people's evenings, had ever felt limiting. He asked it with the amused, slightly condescending curiosity of a tourist encountering a native, and there was a brief, anticipatory silence at the table, as the others waited to see how the question would land. Ethan looked at him with the calm steadiness that had been characteristic of everything he had done that evening, and was about to respond something measured, something honest, something that would have moved the conversation past the question without drama, when Victoria spoke first. She said it with the smooth precision of someone delivering the well-crafted version of a thought they have had many times. Something that had clearly been refined through repetition, into a line that felt to her like wit. Some people dream of building something great. Some people dream of a bigger tip. The table reacted with the laughing compliance that Victoria's remarks reliably produced. Richard Holt settled back in his chair with the satisfied air of a man whose question had been given a better answer than he had managed to construct himself. The assistant did not laugh, but she did not look up from her tablet either. Ethan stood at the edge of the table, and there was a moment, a brief, visible pause, in which something in his expression shifted. Not broke, not revealed the anger that most people in his position would have been feeling, but shifted, slightly, in the way that a landscape shifts when a cloud moves, and the light quality changes in a way that is real and observable even if you cannot fully explain what you are seeing. Victoria looked at him, and there was something in that look, the anticipation of submission, the pleasurable waiting for the flinch that had been present in every interaction between them that evening. She had been, in a very specific and calculated way, testing him all night. She had been waiting for the break. She had been waiting for the moment when he would fold, when he would reveal himself to be exactly what she had decided. He was small, manageable, no match for the force of her disdain. She pressed the advantage she believed she had. She said something that was, even by the standards of everything she had said that evening, remarkable in its cruelty. She looked at Ethan, and then she looked at the table, and she said, "People like him will never sit at a table like this. They can stand next to it their whole lives, and never actually belong here." The room around the VIP alcove had gone the particular quality of quiet that happens when something genuinely inappropriate has been said in a public place. At the table nearby, the woman who had looked down at her plate earlier had put down her fork entirely. A couple at the bar, mid-conversation, had stopped talking. The sommelier, passing with a bottle, paused just inside the edge of the dining room and did not continue. Ethan looked at Victoria Sterling for a long moment. The moment lasted longer than was comfortable, longer than social convention typically permits, long enough that Victoria's expression changed slightly, the first visible crack in the armor of certainty she had been wearing all evening, a hairline fracture of something that was not yet concern but was in the vicinity of it. And then, in a voice that was quiet and level, and carried through the silence of the room with a clarity that was almost architectural, Ethan said the words that had begun this story. "Mock me again. I dare you." Victoria's first response was laughter, the short, dismissive kind that powerful people produce when they encounter something they are not prepared to take seriously. She turned to Richard Holt with an expression that communicated what she intended as ironic appreciation, the implied performance of finding the waiter's outburst charming in its futility. But the laughter did not fully take hold the way it was meant to. The room was too quiet, and Ethan had not moved, and there was something in the way he stood, utterly still, utterly composed, with no trace of the reactive desperation that usually accompanies outbursts in high-pressure situations, that was wrong in a way she could not immediately identify. She looked at him again, and the second look was different from the first. Ethan reached into the pocket of his apron and retrieved his phone. He held it in his hand for a moment, and the gesture was so calm, so deliberate, so entirely without performance, that several people in the immediate vicinity of the VIP table found themselves holding their breath without knowing why. He placed a call, not a text, not an email, a video call. He held the phone outward so the screen was visible to the table, and the call connected, and on the screen of that phone appeared 4 people seated around a conference table in what was clearly a formal business setting, high-ceilinged, professionally lit, with the particular visual gravity of a space where significant decisions are made. Gerald Whitmore was among them. The others were members of the Meridian Capital Partners Board people, whose names, if Victoria had heard them in any other context, she would have recognized immediately. They knew the camera was on. They were composed and professional in the way of people who had been expecting this moment, and they addressed the man holding the phone the way they always addressed him, not as a waiter, not by his first name, not with the casual deference of colleagues, but with the specific, weighted formal respect of men who understood exactly who held authority in their structure. "Mr. Parker," Gerald said, "we're ready when you are." The table processed this information in stages. Richard Holt's expression shifted first, a rapid recalibration of understanding that was visible on his face, in a way that would have been almost comical in other circumstances. The lawyers looked at each other with a focused alertness that suggested rapid professional assessment. The assistant finally put down her tablet. Victoria Sterling sat very still. She was looking at Ethan at the phone in his hand, at the faces on the screen, at the name they had used, at the title they had not needed to say because it was already implied in every syllable of how they were speaking to him. She was, for the first time that evening, doing the calculation. The deal. The fund. The final approval. The consortium whose identity had been deliberately withheld in the transaction documents because the lead partner preferred it that way. The waiter she had been humiliating for the past 2 hours. Ethan turned the phone toward the table so the board members could see the full context of where he was, the white tablecloth, the crystal, the faces of the people who had been his dinner companions in ways they had not chosen, and then he turned it back to himself. "Give me a few minutes, Gerald," he said. He ended the call and put the phone back in his apron pocket. The silence at the table was total. Victoria Sterling's face had undergone a change that was genuinely difficult to describe, not the sudden theatrical collapse of someone caught in a trap, but the slower, more private dissolution of a person watching their understanding of a situation restructure itself in real time. She was not a person who lost her composure easily. She had built her career in part on the ability to maintain poise under pressure, to recalibrate quickly, to never show the room that she was surprised. But this was different in a way that those skills could not fully address, because the recalibration she was being asked to perform was not strategic, it was moral, and those were different faculties. She opened her mouth. What came out was the beginning of an explanation, the specific kind that powerful people reach for when they have been caught behaving badly, and need to bridge the gap between their actions and their self-image. The laughter had been a joke. An unfortunate one. The remarks had been taken out of context. She was under considerable stress. She had not meant to direct her frustration at anyone personally. Ethan let her finish. He did not interrupt. He did not shift his weight, or look away, or perform impatience. He listened to her the way he had listened to everything that evening, fully, calmly, with the complete attention of someone who believes that even difficult things deserve to be heard. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the people in that room would remember for a long time, not because it was eloquent in any theatrical sense, but because it was true in the particular way that true things are recognizable even when they are inconvenient. He told her that the apology she was offering was not what concerned him. He told her that what concerned him was the question of whether the apology would exist if he were, in fact, simply a waiter with no financial power over her business. He said it directly, without heat, as a genuine question rather than a rhetorical weapon. He asked her if the cameras in that room had captured only the evening's conversation without the phone call, without the video, without the revelation of who he was, Would anyone at that table have had any concern for how the waiter was being treated? No one answered. Victoria looked at her hands, which was perhaps the most revealing thing she had done all evening. The lawyers had developed the contained, careful expressions of people who were already thinking about what they had witnessed in terms of professional context. Richard Holt was looking at the table in front of him with the particular expression of a man reassessing several things at once. Ethan looked around the table at all of them, at the assistant, who had finally, genuinely looked at him for the first time that evening, at the investors, who were very still, at Victoria, whose composure was in the process of some private reconstruction that he could see in the set of her shoulders. "If I were just a waiter," he said, "what I experienced tonight would still have happened, and I would have had no recourse. And you would have moved on without thinking about it once." He paused. "That's the part that matters to me. The decision Ethan Parker made that evening was not what anyone in the room expected. Not Victoria, not her lawyers, not the investors, not Gerald and the board members waiting on the other end of a phone call, not the restaurant staff who had gathered in various positions around the edges of the dining room, as word had spread from table to table in the low, rapid current of shared attention. He retrieved his phone from his apron pocket once more and placed the call to Gerald. When the board members appeared on the screen again, there was a particular quality of attention in their faces, the specific alertness of people waiting on a decision that will have significant consequences. Ethan told them he was ready to give his answer. He told them, clearly and without extended preamble, that he was placing the approval for the transaction on hold, not a permanent refusal, a hold. He specified the terms. The deal would be delayed for a period of no less than 45 days, during which Meridian would conduct an independent review of the business practices and workplace culture at Sterling Technologies, not the financials, which were already assessed, but the human dimensions, how people were treated, what the internal culture of the company communicated about its leadership's values, what kind of organization it was when no one with financial power was watching. Victoria, across the table, went very still when she heard the word hold. The lawyers exchanged a glance that contained an entire professional conversation compressed into a second and a half. Richard Holt leaned forward slightly. The alert posture of someone tracking an outcome. Ethan held the phone steady and waited for Gerald's acknowledgement. Gerald, who had known Ethan for more than 20 years and had long since stopped being surprised by the directions his judgment took, said simply that Meridian would proceed accordingly and that the review terms would be formalized in writing by morning. The call ended. Ethan stood at the head of the VIP table and looked at Victoria Sterling for the last time. She had recovered enough of her composure to meet his eyes, but the particular quality of her gaze had changed entirely. The smooth certainty of the woman who had walked into Aurelian 2 hours earlier was gone, replaced by something more complicated and more human. She said his name, his actual name, Mr. Parker. Not a title, not a descriptor, just his name, and she began to speak in the careful, measured way of someone choosing words with genuine care for the first time in a long conversation. She said that she understood the gravity of what had happened. She said that her behavior had been unacceptable. She said it with the specificity of someone who was not performing contrition but working through it in real time. And there was something in that the visible difficulty of the reckoning that was more honest than a polished apology would have been. Ethan heard all of it. He did not tell her it was fine, because it was not fine, and saying so would have been a small lie in service of social comfort. And he did not traffic in those. He did not tell her she was forgiven, because forgiveness of that particular kind was not his to give the people who had overheard the evening's events, the young server Marcus, who had absorbed the lesson of it, the woman at the nearby table who had put down her fork and gone home, and told her partner what she had witnessed. Those people were not present to offer their portion of the reckoning. What he told her was simpler than any of that, and more durable. Ethan removed his apron. He folded it with the particular precision of someone who respects the work even when the shift is over, and he set it on the edge of the service cart beside the VIP table. He was not fired. Sandra Lim had made that clear in the brief exchange they had had near the service corridor, with the quiet certainty of a manager who had watched the evening develop and had her own views about how its participants had conducted themselves. He was simply done for the night. in the way that a person is done when a shift ends and the work of the hours has been completed. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the table at Victoria, at the investors, at the lawyers, at the assistant who was looking back at him with an expression he found difficult to categorize but which contained, he thought, something like recognition. He looked at Marcus, who was standing near the host stand with the wide, careful eyes of a young man who had just watched something he would be thinking about for a very long time. He looked at the room, the warm light, the crystal, the careful architecture of a place designed to make people feel that they existed at the highest possible altitude of human experience. He thought about Claire, the way he did at the end of every shift, the way he did at the end of every day, because she was woven into every version of his life, the old one and the new one. He thought about Maya, asleep now in their apartment in Queens, who would be awake in the morning with questions about his day, as she always was, because she had inherited her mother's genuine curiosity about other people, and had never quite grown out of asking. He turned back to the table one final time and spoke quietly into the space between himself and Victoria Sterling, in a voice intended for everyone who had been present that evening, but addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone in particular, which amounted to the same thing. Money can buy power, he said. It can buy influence. It can buy access to rooms like this one, and the table at the center of those rooms, and the people around that table. But respect, he paused. The brief pause of someone giving a word, the weight it deserves, respect, has to be earned. He held the stillness for one more moment. Then he walked toward the front of the restaurant. Through the warm light and the careful silence of people still processing what they had witnessed, past the host stand where Marcus was standing with his hand slightly raised in a gesture he perhaps did not intend as a farewell, but which landed that way, and through the door into the Manhattan night. Behind him, the restaurant remained very quiet. Victoria Sterling sat at the head of the VIP table, with her hands folded in front of her, and looked at the empty space where the waiter had been standing, and did not speak for a long time. The investors did not fill the silence. The lawyers reviewed their notes. The assistant picked up her tablet and then set it down again. The candles continued their patient burning. Outside, the city was its usual self, vast and indifferent, and full of people who were doing the complicated, quiet, daily work of being human in ways that no one would ever report on or remember. People carrying things and making things and tending to the small, essential business of lives that did not make headlines and did not require them to. Ethan walked to the subway. He found a seat in the car. He took out his phone and sent a text to Maya that said he was on his way home and that everything was fine and that he would see her in the morning. She texted back a single emoji, a small, lit candle, which was a thing she did when she wanted to say goodnight without words. Had been doing it since she was 9 years old and had discovered that sometimes images carried more than language. He looked at the candle on his phone screen for a moment. Then, he put the phone in his pocket. The train moved through the dark underground of the city, and Ethan Parker sat in the ordinary light of the ordinary car, among ordinary people going home from their ordinary days. And he was, in the specific and non-trivial way that matters most, exactly who he had been at the beginning of the evening. A father, a man of quiet convictions, a person who had decided long ago what he was worth and had never found a reason to revise the estimate. The arc of the evening would work its consequences in the days that followed the 45-day review that Meridian launched, the coverage that emerged when the story could no longer be contained in the professional circles where it began to circulate, the conversation that would happen in Victoria Sterling's board meetings about culture and leadership and the invisible costs of how power behaves when it believes itself unobserved. Those consequences would unfold, as consequences do, in their own time and in ways that were not entirely predictable. The review itself proved instructive. The Meridian team's findings were not catastrophic. Sterling Technologies was, by technical measures, a well-functioning company, but they were uncomfortable in the specific, documented way that forces boards to have conversations they have been avoiding. Senior employees described a culture shaped from the top, where performance was demanded and dignity was optional, where the people who delivered results learned to insulate themselves from the leadership's more corrosive tendencies, and the people who could not were quietly replaced. Victoria, To her credit, and this was a credit the people who had been in that restaurant were willing to give her, slowly, and with considerable reservation, did not dismiss the findings. She sat with a report that held a mirror to the version of herself that had stood in Aurelian's dining room that evening, and made choices, and she did not enjoy what she read. Whether the discomfort would ultimately change her, whether the reckoning of one evening and one review could undo the accumulated habits of decades of unchallenged power, was a question that the weeks and months ahead would answer. Some people change when they are given the genuine opportunity to see themselves clearly, and some people find explanations for why the mirror must be wrong. Which kind of person Victoria Sterling was remained, at this particular moment in the story, genuinely open. But that was not the point either. The point was something smaller and more permanent, something that lived not in the outcomes but in the space between a question asked and an answer given, between a moment of cruelty and the choice of how to meet it. The point was what it meant to know your own worth so completely, so quietly, so unconditionally, that nothing anyone said at a dinner table could touch it, let alone reduce it. The point was a man who had lost the most important person in his life, and had rebuilt himself not around what he had accumulated, but around what he refused to surrender: his composure, his kindness, his absolute refusal to let someone else's contempt become his own self-definition. The point was a folded apron on the edge of a service cart, a text message, and a lit candle on a phone screen. A man on a late train, going home to the daughter who needed him, carrying nothing he had not brought with him, and leaving behind, in a candlelit room full of powerful and suddenly very quiet people, the clear and ringing evidence that the most formidable thing in any room is not the person with the most money, or the largest title, or the sharpest capacity for cruelty. It is the person who already knows, with absolute and unshakable certainty, exactly who they are.